Welcome to Champion Stories. If this is your first time here, subscribe now and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. And now, on to today's story. The morning sun filtered through the curtains of Manny Pacquiao's Manila office, casting long shadows across the mahogany desk where countless documents awaited his attention. But today, his focus wasn't on the papers before him. Instead, his weathered hands held a single photograph, a faded image of himself as a barefoot 7-year-old boy, standing outside a dilapidated school in General Santos City. The memory struck him like a thunderbolt to the chest. He could still feel the rough texture of that worn wooden door he had pressed his face against, watching other children through the cracked windows as they bent over their books. Their uniforms were clean, their shoes polished, their futures seemingly secure. He had wanted nothing more than to join them, to sit at those desks and learn to read the words that danced mysteriously across the pages. But poverty had been a merciless gatekeeper. While other children carried backpacks filled with hope, Manny carried the weight of an empty stomach and the responsibility of helping his mother, Dionysia, put food on their table. Education had been a luxury they simply couldn't afford, a distant dream that seemed as unreachable as the stars. Now, 43 years later, Senator Manny Pacquiao sat in one of the most powerful positions in the Philippines, surrounded by the trappings of success that his younger self could never have imagined. Yet the ache of that lost opportunity remained as fresh as ever. Every illiterate adult he met on the streets, every child forced to choose between school and survival, reminded him of the boy he once was. The inspiration had come to him during a visit to a remote barangay in Mindanao 3 months earlier. He had watched a young girl named Ligaya, no older than 8, selling sampaguita flowers instead of attending classes. When he asked her why she wasn't in school, her response had shattered something deep within his soul. The registration fees, the uniform costs, the school supplies, they were mountains too high for her family to climb. That night, Manny had called his chief of staff, a dedicated man named Angelo, and instructed him to begin drafting what would become the most important legislation of his political career. The Free Quality Public Education Act wouldn't just eliminate school fees, it would provide free meals, uniforms, books, and transportation for every Filipino child from kindergarten through high school. But the path to this moment had been treacherous. For months, he had faced opposition from colleagues who questioned the financial feasibility of such an ambitious program. Some accused him of political grandstanding, others worried about the budgetary implications. There were late nights spent revising proposals, countless meetings with education experts, and moments of doubt when the dream seemed impossible. Through it all, Jinky had been his constant source of strength. She understood the fire that burned within him, the need to transform his personal pain into national progress. Their children, Jimuel, Michael, Princess, Queen Elizabeth, and Israel, had grown up with privileges he could only have dreamed of, but they also understood their father's mission to ensure no Filipino child would face the barriers he once did. As Manny set the photograph back on his desk, his phone buzzed with a message from Angelo. The Senate floor was ready. After 6 months of intense debate, amendments, and negotiations, the final vote on the Free Quality Public Education Act was scheduled to begin in 1 hour. He stood slowly, adjusting his barong Tagalog with the same careful precision he had once used to lace his boxing gloves. This wasn't a fight for a championship belt. This was a battle for the souls and futures of millions of Filipino children. The stakes had never been higher, and failure wasn't an option. The boy who had once pressed his face against a school window was about to change the course of Philippine education forever. The Senate building rose before Manny, like a monument to democracy, its neoclassical columns standing as silent witnesses to decades of Philippine history. As his car pulled up to the entrance, he noticed the unusual crowd gathered on the steps, teachers holding handmade signs, parents clutching their children's hands, and students from various universities who had traveled from across the archipelago to witness this historic moment. Among them, he spotted an elderly woman named Rosario, a retired public school teacher from Bataan whom he had met during his campaign visits. Her weathered face bore the lines of 4 decades spent in overcrowded classrooms, teaching children whose dreams often withered under the harsh reality of educational inequality. She held a banner that read, "For every Filipino child's tomorrow," and when their eyes met, she pressed her hand to her heart and nodded with quiet dignity. The weight of their expectations settled on Manny's shoulders as he walked through the marble corridors of the Senate. Each step echoed with memories of his own educational journey, or rather, the lack thereof. He remembered the humiliation of not being able to read the basic contracts when he first started boxing professionally, how he had to rely on others to explain the terms that would shape his career. In the Senate chamber, his colleagues were already taking their positions. Senator Teodoro, a longtime advocate for social reform, offered an encouraging smile from across the aisle. Senator Estrella, known for her meticulous attention to budgetary details, reviewed her notes one final time. The opposition, led by Senator Gregorio, maintained their skeptical expressions, though Manny sensed that even some of them were beginning to waver in their resistance. As the session began, Manny's mind drifted to a conversation he'd had with his mother, Dionysia, just days earlier. She had spoken about her own regrets, how she had wanted to give him and his siblings a proper education, but simply couldn't afford it. Her voice had cracked when she mentioned the shame she carried for decades, believing she had failed her children. This law wasn't just about future generations. It was about healing the wounds of the past. The Senate president, a distinguished man named Aurelio, called for order as the final debate commenced. One by one, senators rose to present their arguments. Those in favor spoke passionately about social equity and national development. The opposition raised concerns about fiscal responsibility and implementation challenges. Each word was carefully weighed, each argument scrutinized, knowing that the decision made today would impact millions of Filipino families. Manny thought about Ligaya, the young flower seller who had unknowingly sparked this entire legislative journey. Was she sitting in a classroom right now, or was she still on the streets, sacrificing her education for her family's survival? He thought about the countless children in remote island communities who had never seen the inside of a proper school building, and urban slum dwellers whose potential remained buried under layers of poverty and circumstance. The debate intensified as economic projections were discussed. Critics argued that the program's estimated cost of 200 billion pesos annually would strain the national budget beyond its limits. Supporters countered that the long-term economic benefits of an educated population would far outweigh the initial investment. As the hours passed, Manny observed the subtle shifts in the chamber's atmosphere. Several undecided senators seemed increasingly swayed by the testimonials from education experts who had been invited to provide technical input. Dr. Amihan, a respected economist from the University of the Philippines, presented compelling data showing how similar programs in other countries had generated significant returns on investment within a decade. The moment was approaching when Manny would need to make his final statement before the vote. His heart pounded as he prepared to stand before his colleagues and the Filipino people, knowing that the next few minutes could change the trajectory of his nation's future forever. Manny rose from his seat with deliberate slowness, his legs feeling heavier than they ever had during his most grueling boxing matches. The chamber fell into an expectant silence as all eyes turned toward the man who had once conquered the world's boxing rings and now sought to conquer educational inequality in his homeland. He began by sharing the story of his childhood, painting vivid images of the tin-roofed shack where he grew up, where rain leaked through countless holes and textbooks were as rare as full meals. His voice carried the weight of authenticity as he described watching his classmates through school windows, feeling like an outsider, looking into a world that seemed forever beyond his reach. The senators listened with unusual intensity, many hearing these personal details for the first time. Senator Remedios, a former educator herself, wiped away tears as Manny recounted his mother's daily struggle to choose between buying rice for dinner or saving pesos for his potential school enrollment. Even the most hardened opposition members, including Senator Celestino, who had been particularly vocal in his criticism, sat in contemplative silence as the champion's words filled the chamber. Manny spoke about the boxer he met early in his career, a young man named Florentino from Cebu, who had exceptional talent but couldn't read the contracts he was signing. Promoters had taken advantage of his illiteracy, cheating him out of earnings that could have changed his family's life forever. That boxer had died young, poor and forgotten, a casualty of a system that failed to protect its most vulnerable citizens. The emotional core of his speech centered on a recent visit to a rural school in Palawan, where he had met a teacher named Clarita, who had been using her own salary to buy chalk and paper for her students. She taught in a classroom with no electricity, no proper desks, and textbooks so old that many pages were missing. Yet her students' enthusiasm for learning had burned brighter than any light bulb could have illuminated. As Manny detailed the specific provisions of the proposed law, he painted a picture of transformation that went far beyond mere policy changes. He envisioned school feeding programs that would ensure no child learned on an empty stomach, free transportation that would connect isolated communities to educational opportunities, and comprehensive support systems that would make dreams accessible to every Filipino family, regardless of their economic status. The opposition's concerns about fiscal sustainability were addressed with a passionate plea for perspective. Manny reminded his colleagues that the Philippines spent more on debt servicing than on education, more on political perks than on public schools. He challenged them to consider what kind of nation they wanted to leave for their own children and grandchildren. Senator Imelda, known for her pragmatic approach to legislation, found herself nodding as Manny outlined the implementation timeline. The program would begin in the most disadvantaged regions, gradually expanding nationwide over 3 years. Local government units would be empowered to adapt the program to their specific needs, ensuring that cultural sensitivity and regional differences were respected. The chamber's atmosphere shifted palpably as Manny concluded his remarks. He spoke directly to the gallery where Rosario and other educators sat, acknowledging their decades of service under impossible conditions. He promised that this law would not just provide resources, but would restore dignity to the teaching profession and hope to countless families who had resigned themselves to perpetual poverty. As he took his seat, the silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. Senator Aurelio cleared his throat and announced that the formal voting would commence in 15 minutes, allowing senators time for final consultations with their staff and constituents. The tension in the chamber was electric. Some senators huddled in urgent conversations, while others sat in quiet contemplation. Outside, the crowd had grown larger, with live television coverage broadcasting the proceedings to millions of Filipinos across the archipelago. Manny closed his eyes and offered a silent prayer, knowing that the next few minutes would determine whether his lifelong dream of educational equality would become reality or remain forever unfulfilled. The 15-minute recess felt like a lifetime suspended in amber. Manny watched as his colleagues engaged in hushed conversations throughout the chamber, their body language revealing the internal struggles playing out behind closed doors. Senator Teodoro approached several undecided members, his gentle but persuasive manner evident in every gesture. Meanwhile, Senator Gregorio maintained his position near the opposition bloc, though his usual confident demeanor seemed slightly shaken. In the gallery, the crowd had grown restless with anticipation. Rosario clutched her banner tighter, her knuckles white with tension. Beside her sat a young man named Bayani, a recent college graduate who had worked 3 jobs to pay for his education. His presence represented the countless students who understood firsthand the transformative power of accessible learning. Manny's phone buzzed with a message from Jinky, who was watching the live coverage from their home in General Santos. She had sent a simple but powerful image, a photo of their children studying together at their dining table, with the words, "For every Filipino family," written beneath it. The sight of his own children's educational opportunities, taken for granted in their privileged household, reminded him of the stark inequality this law sought to address. Senator Aurelio returned to his position and called the chamber back to order. The formal voting procedure would follow alphabetical order, with each senator stating their position clearly for the record. The tension was suffocating as the first name was called: Senator Adela, a veteran legislator known for her unpredictable voting patterns. Her voice rang clear and strong as she cast her vote in favor of the bill. One by one, the votes were tallied. Senator Ernesto, representing a rural province with limited educational infrastructure, voted yes with visible emotion. Senator Gemma, whose constituency included several urban slums, also supported the measure. The momentum seemed to be building, but several key swing votes remained uncertain. When Senator Celestino's name was called, the chamber held its collective breath. He had been one of the most vocal opponents during the committee hearings, raising concerns about fiscal responsibility and implementation challenges. He stood slowly, his weathered face reflecting decades of political experience. After a pause that seemed to stretch into eternity, he announced his support for the bill, citing the compelling arguments presented during the final debate. The shift was palpable. Senator Herminia, who had been fence-sitting for weeks, followed suit with an enthusiastic endorsement. Even Senator Norberto, known for his conservative fiscal policies, surprised everyone by voting in favor, explaining that the long-term economic benefits outweighed the short-term costs. As the voting continued, Manny found his mind wandering to a remote elementary school he had visited in Mountain Province 6 months earlier. The teacher there, a dedicated woman named Salvacion, had been using torn cardboard as writing surfaces because proper notebooks were too expensive for most families. Her students had performed a traditional dance for his visit, their bright smiles masking the harsh reality of their educational limitations. He thought about the teenage boy named Vicente from Tawi-Tawi, who had never owned a complete set of textbooks, yet dreamed of becoming an engineer. The girl named Leilani from Batangas, who sold vegetables in the market before and after school to help pay for her uniform. The countless stories of potential stifled by circumstances beyond individual control. The voting tally continued climbing in favor of the bill. 23 senators had voted yes, with only 8 opposing and several abstentions. The required majority was within reach, but the final few votes would determine whether this historic legislation would pass into law. Senator Pilar, representing one of the wealthiest districts in Metro Manila, cast her vote against the measure, citing concerns about taxpayer burden. Her decision was met with disappointed murmurs from the gallery, but the overall momentum remained strong. As the alphabetical roll call neared its end, Manny realized that his own vote, though symbolically important, would not be the deciding factor. The mathematics were clear. The Free Quality Public Education Act had secured enough support to pass, marking a watershed moment in Philippine legislative history. The chamber buzzed with barely contained excitement as the final votes were cast, bringing the nation one step closer to educational transformation. Senator Aurelio's voice echoed through the chamber as he announced the final tally. 31 votes in favor, 12 against each, with 1 abstention. The Free Quality Public Education Act had officially passed the Senate by an overwhelming majority, sending shockwaves of celebration throughout the building and across the nation. The gallery erupted in thunderous applause. Rosario, the retired teacher from Bataan, stood with tears streaming down her weathered cheeks, her banner trembling in her hands. Bayani, the young graduate beside her, threw his fist into the air with unbridled joy. The sound of celebration was deafening, a symphony of hope that had been building for generations. Manny remained seated for a moment, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had just occurred. His hands shook as the reality settled in. The dream he had carried since childhood, the vision that had sustained him through months of political battles, had finally become reality. This wasn't just a legislative victory. It was the fulfillment of a promise made to every Filipino child who had ever pressed their face against a classroom window, longing for the opportunity to learn. Fellow senators approached him with congratulations. Senator Teodoro, his longtime ally, embraced him warmly, whispering words of admiration for his unwavering dedication. Even some opposition members, including Senator Joaquin, who had voted against the bill, acknowledged the historic significance of the moment and offered respectful handshakes. The celebration extended far beyond the Senate walls. Across the Philippines, television screens in public squares, internet cafes, and family homes broadcast the momentous news. In remote villages where electricity was sporadic, families gathered around battery-powered radios to hear the announcement that would transform their children's futures. In General Santos City, Manny's hometown, the reaction was particularly emotional. At the old elementary school where he had once stood as an outsider, current students and teachers watched the live coverage in their cramped, multi-purpose room. Principal Elena, a woman who had dedicated her life to education despite inadequate resources, wept openly as she realized that her students would soon have access to opportunities she had only dreamed of providing. News of the Senate's decision reached Jinky at their family home, where she had been anxiously watching with their children. Jimuel, their eldest son, understood the significance of his father's achievement and felt a surge of pride that went beyond typical filial admiration. This was about legacy, about using privilege and position to lift others up rather than simply accumulating personal wealth. The immediate aftermath brought a flood of media requests and interview opportunities. Reporters from national and international outlets sought comments from the man who had just orchestrated one of the most significant educational reforms in Philippine history. However, Manny's thoughts remained focused on the real beneficiaries of this legislation, the children who would never again have to choose between education and survival. Text messages poured in from across the political spectrum. Former opponents acknowledged the bill's potential impact, while longtime supporters expressed their admiration for his persistence in the face of seemingly insurmountable obstacles. International education advocates praised the Philippines for taking such a bold step toward universal access to quality learning. As the initial celebration began to subside, the weight of implementation began to settle on Manny's shoulders. Passing the law was only the beginning. Ensuring its effective execution would require continued vigilance, adequate funding mechanisms, and coordination with local government units across the archipelago's 7,000 islands. But for now, in this moment of triumph, Manny allowed himself to savor the victory. The boy who had once sold cigarettes on the streets instead of attending classes had just guaranteed that future generations would never face that same impossible choice. The tears in his eyes reflected not just personal satisfaction, but the collective joy of a nation taking a giant leap toward educational equality. As Manny stepped out of the Senate building, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the crowd that had gathered to witness history in the making. The sea of faces before him represented every corner of Philippine society, from weathered farmers who had traveled from distant provinces to young university students whose futures had just been fundamentally altered. The crowd parted respectfully as he made his way toward his vehicle, but their emotions were impossible to contain. An elderly man named Rafael, whose calloused hands spoke of decades of manual labor, reached out to touch Manny's shoulder. His eyes, clouded with age but bright with gratitude, conveyed what words could not express. This law meant his grandchildren would have opportunities he could never have imagined for his own children. Near the edge of the crowd stood a young teacher named Marilu from Mindoro, who had taken a bus for 8 hours to be present for this historic vote. She clutched a worn notebook filled with lesson plans she had created using her own resources, hoping one day to have proper materials for her students. As Manny passed, she whispered a heartfelt thank you that carried the weight of her profession's long struggle for recognition and support. The drive through Manila's bustling streets revealed a city transformed by news of the law's passage. Electronic billboards displayed breaking news alerts, while social media platforms buzzed with celebratory messages from Filipinos around the world. The hashtag Changchun Education for All was trending globally, putting the Philippines at the center of international conversations about educational equity. At a stoplight in Quezon City, Manny noticed a group of street children gathered around a smartphone, watching news coverage of the Senate vote. Among them was a boy who reminded him powerfully of his younger self. Thin, determined, with eyes that held both hardship and hope, the sight reinforced his understanding that this law was about more than policy. It was about human dignity and the fundamental right of every child to dream beyond their circumstances. His phone rang with a call from Dr. Corazon, the Secretary of Education, who was already coordinating with regional offices to begin implementation planning. The conversation revealed the enormous logistical challenges ahead, training thousands of teachers, establishing distribution systems for free materials, and creating infrastructure in areas where proper schools had never existed. Yet her voice carried excitement rather than trepidation, energized by the unprecedented opportunity to transform an entire nation's educational landscape. As evening approached, Manny made an unscheduled stop at a public elementary school in Pasig. Word of his arrival spread quickly, and within minutes, parents and children had gathered in the school courtyard. The principal, a dedicated woman named Aurora, had been working at the school for 15 years, watching talented students drop out due to financial constraints year after year. The children performed an impromptu welcome song, their voices harmonizing beautifully despite having no musical instruments or proper stage. Their performance embodied the potential that had been locked away by economic barriers for far too long. Now, these same children would receive not just free education, but the comprehensive support system needed to nurture their talents and aspirations. Local news crews arrived to capture the spontaneous celebration, interviewing parents who spoke through tears about what this law meant for their families. A mother named Teresa explained how she had been working double shifts as a laundrywoman to save money for her daughter's high school enrollment. Now, those savings could be used for other necessities, and her daughter's education was guaranteed. As Manny finally headed home to General Santos City, he carried with him the faces and stories of everyone he had encountered that day. The magnitude of what had been accomplished was beginning to sink in, but so was the enormous responsibility that lay ahead. The law was passed, but the real work, transforming millions of lives through education, was just beginning. The boy who had once dreamed of sitting in a classroom was now responsible for ensuring that dream became reality for every Filipino child. The familiar sight of General Santos City's skyline brought a flood of emotions as Manny's plane descended toward the airport. Below, the city that had shaped him spread out like a living map of his memories. The harbor where his father once worked, the neighborhoods where he had sold cigarettes as a child, and the boxing gym where his dreams had first taken flight. Jinky and their children waited at the airport, along with what seemed like half the city. The crowd was different from the political gathering in Manila. These were his neighbors, childhood friends, and the people who had known him long before championships and senatorial seats. Their celebration felt more intimate, more personal, rooted in shared history and genuine affection. The drive home took them through the streets of his childhood. At a red light near the old public market, Manny spotted an elderly vendor named Domingo, who had sold fruits from the same corner for over 30 years. The man's weathered face broke into a proud grin as he recognized the senator, raising his hand in a respectful salute. This law would ensure that Domingo's grandson, currently struggling with school fees, would never face the same educational barriers. At their family home, the children gathered around the dining table where homework had become a nightly ritual. Princess showed him her mathematics workbook, completely unaware that her easy access to quality education had been a luxury beyond her father's childhood reach. Queen Elizabeth practiced reading aloud, her fluent pronunciation a stark contrast to Manny's own struggles with literacy during his early boxing career. That evening, Manny walked alone through the old neighborhood where he had grown up. The house where his family had lived was now occupied by another struggling family, a young mother named Violeta and her 3 children. She recognized him immediately and invited him inside, serving instant coffee in chipped mugs while sharing her own educational struggles. Violeta's eldest son, Dante, was 14 and desperately wanted to continue his studies, but the family could barely afford his current school supplies. His notebooks were filled with careful handwriting, mathematical calculations that showed genuine aptitude despite his challenging circumstances. In 2 months, when the new law took effect, Dante's dreams would no longer depend on his family's financial situation. The conversation with Violeta reminded Manny of his mother's daily struggles decades earlier. Dionysia had wanted desperately to educate her children, but faced impossible choices between immediate survival and long-term dreams. Now no Filipino parent would have to make that heartbreaking decision. As night fell, Manny visited the elementary school he had once watched from outside. The security guard, an old man named Rogelio, unlocked the gate and led him through the empty corridors. In the moonlight streaming through classroom windows, Manny could almost see the ghosts of all the children who had studied here over the decades, and all those who had been turned away. Standing in one of the classrooms, surrounded by tiny desks and colorful posters about the alphabet and basic mathematics, Manny felt the full circle of his journey. The boy who had pressed his face against these windows had returned as the man who ensured no child would ever stand outside looking in again. Tomorrow, the real work would begin, transforming legislative victory into educational reality. But tonight, in this quiet classroom, Manny allowed himself to feel the profound satisfaction of a promise kept to his younger self and to every Filipino child who deserved a chance to learn. 3 months after the historic vote, Manny stood at the entrance of a newly renovated elementary school in one of Mindanao's most remote barangays. The transformation was breathtaking. What had once been a dilapidated structure with holes in the roof was now a vibrant learning center equipped with proper desks, modern blackboards, and shelves lined with brand new textbooks. The morning ceremony marked the official launch of the Free Quality Public Education Act's implementation across the region. Children arrived wearing crisp new uniforms provided by the program, their faces glowing with excitement and anticipation. Among them was Ligaya, the young flower seller whose plight had originally inspired this legislative journey. She clutched a backpack filled with supplies she had never owned before, her eyes wide with wonder at the possibilities that lay ahead. Principal Josefina, a veteran educator who had spent 2 decades teaching with inadequate resources, welcomed each student personally at the school gate. Her voice trembled with emotion as she addressed the gathered families, explaining how the new program would provide not just free education, but comprehensive support, including meals, transportation, and after-school programs designed to nurture every child's potential. The first day's schedule included a special assembly where Manny spoke directly to the students about the power of education to transform lives. He shared stories of his own struggles with literacy, how his lack of formal schooling had created barriers throughout his early career, and how their generation would never face those same limitations. The children listened with rapt attention, understanding instinctively that they were witnessing the beginning of something extraordinary. In the audience sat Carmelita, a single mother who worked as a seamstress to support her 4 children. For years, she had sacrificed meals to save money for school fees, often choosing which child could attend classes each semester based on their academic performance. Now, tears streamed down her face as she watched all 4 of her children sitting together in the same classroom for the first time in their lives. The program's impact extended far beyond individual families. Local teacher Hernando, who had been considering leaving the profession due to inadequate pay and resources, found renewed purpose in his calling. The law included provisions for teacher salary increases, professional development opportunities, and classroom support that transformed the educational profession from survival job to respected career. As the weeks progressed, the ripple effects became increasingly visible throughout the community. Children who had previously worked in fields or markets during school hours were now focused entirely on their studies. Families could invest their limited resources in other necessities, like healthcare and home improvements, creating an upward economic spiral that benefited entire neighborhoods. Manny received regular reports from education officials across the archipelago detailing similar transformations. In Luzon, a fishing village had seen its first high school graduates in over a decade. In the Visayas, indigenous communities were accessing formal education while maintaining their cultural traditions through specially designed curriculum adaptations. The program was succeeding beyond even the most optimistic projections. 6 months later, Manny returned to the same remote school for a follow-up visit. The changes were remarkable. Student enrollment had doubled, attendance rates approached 100%, and academic performance indicators showed dramatic improvements. Ligaya, now fluent in reading, presented him with a handwritten letter expressing her dreams of becoming a teacher herself one day. Standing in that transformed classroom, surrounded by eager young faces representing the future of the Philippines, Manny felt the profound satisfaction of a life's work completed. The boy who had once pressed his face against school windows had not only entered those classrooms, but had opened their doors for millions of others. The Free Quality Public Education Act had become more than legislation. It was a testament to the transformative power of determined leadership and the unwavering belief that every child, regardless of their circumstances, deserved the opportunity to learn, grow, and contribute to their nation's future. As the final bell rang and children rushed out to share their new knowledge with families and friends, Manny knew that the seeds of progress planted through this law would continue growing for generations, creating a legacy that transcended any championship belt or political achievement. Thank you for watching another episode of Champion Stories. If you enjoyed today's story, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of our upcoming inspiring tales about Manny Pacquiao. Share your thoughts in the comments. We read every single one, and many times your ideas inspire our next episode. See you next time. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to leave your like and subscribe to our channel.